Please be advised, this episode does have content that some may find distressing. As always, listener discretion is advised and it is not suitable for anyone under the age of 13.
Hello and welcome to It's Murder Up North. In the previous episode I covered the case of Timothy Evans, who on the 9th of March 1950 was executed by Albert Pierrepoint, with the public expressing little sympathy for the condemned man. After all, he had been found guilty of infanticide. But this would be the proverbial calm before the storm. For the next couple of years, Albert Pierrepoint's life was relatively quiet. He had taken over the ownership of the Rose and Crown pub in Hull, Preston, and noted that the Royal Commission, who had been reviewing the viability of the death penalty, which I discussed in the Derek Bentley episode, had, in Albert's own words, gone into hibernation to consider what their report should be. The beginning of 1953 would see a further shift in people's opinions towards the death penalty, when 19-year-old Derek Bentley was hanged by Albert in January, and more controversy would come when, on July 1953, Albert was summoned to carry out the execution of John Reginald Halliday Christie, a man who 3 years earlier had testified in court against Timothy Evans, and as a primary witness it was his words that had helped to secure the conviction. With the conclusion of Timothy Evans's trial, Ethel and John Christie returned to their ground floor flat at 10 Rillington Place, hoping to move on from the terrible crimes that had occurred where 19-year-old Beryl Evans and her 13-month-old daughter Geraldine had been murdered, and their bodies had been discarded in the washhouse at the rear of the property. Although he had confessed and was charged for the murder of Beryl, Timothy Evans was only tried for the death of his daughter, to prevent the defence from claiming that he had been provoked. As the star witness in the trial, Christie's character had been called into question. He had been accused by the defendant of being the murderer, and the defence attempted to discredit Christie by presenting his prior criminal convictions to the court. These disclosures did not sway the jury's decision. After all, the 50-year-old's last offence had been 17 years prior. He could be considered a reformed character that had gone on to serve as a police officer during the Second World War. The publishing of Christie's criminal convictions did, however, affect his life outside of the courtroom. For the previous 4 years he had been working at the Post Office Savings Bank, where he worked as a ledger clerk, a role which required him to be trustworthy and honest. Yet he had failed to inform them of his previous convictions for theft and deception, for which he was subsequently dismissed. Christie would find another job, and it would be a further 2 years before his dark deeds would be exposed, casting doubt on Timothy Evans's conviction. Join me as I delve into the life and crimes of John Christie, and explore whether he helped send an innocent man to the gallows in order to cover up his own murderous deeds. Information regarding John Christie's early years comes from him directly, primarily from exclusive interviews he provided the Sunday Pictorial prior to his execution. Yet with his propensity for bending the truth, and in some cases claiming his memory is tainted, we must view his version with a degree of caution. As F. Tennyson Jesse, the famed criminologist, journalist and author, wrote, quote, "It is impossible to take any statement of Christie's as true unless it is corroborated by someone else." We do know that John Reginald Halliday Christie was born in Halifax, Yorkshire, on April 8, 1899, just 5 miles away from where his executioner, Albert Pierrepoint, would be born 6 years later. At the time of his birth, Halifax had been a flourishing textile town. With it sitting on the border of Lancashire and Yorkshire, the town's success came from its various textile mills, whose chimneys once dominated the area, belching out thick smoke that covered the homes in layers of soot, creating a grubby and grey appearance. Like with many mill towns, there was a clear distinction between the homes of the workforce and those who owned the factories, with small terraced houses creeping up the steep slopes of the hillsides, while more elaborate detached homes were constructed, usually set within large grounds, for the more senior members of the factory. The Christies were situated in the middle of the class system, with their father Ernest being employed as a carpet designer he could afford to provide his wife Mary and their 7 children a comfortable existence. They were not rich by any means, but were able to live in the more spacious accommodation in comparison to the unskilled workers of the town. John, who was the couple's 6th child, spent the first 2 years of his life living at a former coaching inn, sat above the valley, accessed by a narrow track, from where he would have seen the sprawling industrial landscape of the town, with the abundance of large mills and their towering chimneys emitting black smoke into the air. By the time John was 8 years old, he had lived in 3 houses, which was not unusual for the time, as most families rented rather than owned properties. The family was now residing in Iona House, a relatively large, detached property surrounded by rows of brownstone terraced homes in the Boothstown area of Halifax. Each day, John and his older siblings made the 5-minute journey to the local school, where the youngster would discover his love of learning. In later life, Christie's IQ was assessed as being 128, and his performance at school reflected this intellect. He excelled at maths, and also loved history, and by the time he was 11, he had earned a scholarship to attend Halifax Secondary School. Christie, like his fellow serial killer, John George Hay, who lived just 20 miles away, had also been part of a choir, and was a relatively lonely child, who failed to form lasting friendships. His classmates later recalled that Christie was, quote, a queer lad who kept himself to himself, and was not very popular. It is speculated that John's home life shaped his character, with him being raised by an overprotective mother and dominating older sisters. For a boy growing up at that time, when the man was the head of the household and women answered to them, Christie grew to resent being controlled by his sisters, who emasculated him. This would take on more significance as he entered his teenage years, when he became sexually aroused in the presence of one of his siblings. Ludovic Kennedy, who authored 10 Rillington Place, which at the time of publication was seen as the definitive guide to the case, commented on Christie's experience with his sister, stating, "There was nothing unusual in this, for it is often through their sisters that small boys first find themselves physically disturbed by the opposite sex. But in Christie's case it exaggerated an already tense situation. He had always resented his sisters bossing him about, and now, to add salt to his wounds, he found himself physically attracted to them. He both loved and hated them, because they aroused his masculinity, and then stifled it, and this went on day after day, month after month, year after year." It has been speculated that Christie was repulsed when he became aroused while around his sibling. Feeling betrayed by his own body, it began to affect him psychologically, with him developing an inability to perform sexually. This would soon become noted by his peers, when his first sexual encounters proved to be futile. Gossip quickly spread, resulting in Christie being teased with nicknames like Reggie Nordic and Can't Do It Christie, which further added to his resentment of women, and him developing a growing sense of inferiority. He would eventually lose his virginity to a sex worker while in his late teens, and in doing so, he discovered that he could perform when he felt that he was in control, leading Christie to regularly pay for sex even after he was married. Part of his inferiority complex may have also been formed from his relationship with his older brother and father, who had both enjoyed success in their professional and personal lives. His older brother, Percy, would become a bank manager in Leeds, and married a local councillor's daughter, elevating his standing in the community. But it is possibly Christie's relationship with his father that created the fastidious side of his nature. John grew up at a time when a child should be seen and not heard, and corporal punishment was an acceptable form of discipline. As such, his father would expect complete obedience from his offspring, with Christie claiming that if they were not submissive, they would be at the whim of his father's temper. As well as expecting his children's compliance, Ernest was always very particular with regards to his household being one of peace and order. He was especially adamant that on a Sunday, having been working hard all week, that the home should be silent while he sat and read his newspaper. Ernest was a strict man, but no more than any other father of the time, and he strived to set a good example for his children by being a hard-working and well-respected member of the community. As such, he was part of a number of associations, with him acting as a treasurer for one and was a chairman of another. Ernest was also involved in the Boy Scouts and St. John's Ambulance, perhaps in an attempt to appease his father and maybe garner his approval. John would strive to follow in his footsteps. He would become a member of the Boy Scouts, rising to the highest rank of King Scout and acting as assistant leader for a short while. He would also join the local St. John's Ambulance, where he learned to administer first aid during medical emergencies. The relationship Christie had with his father was complex. On one hand, he feared him, but on the other hand, he wanted to appease him and emulate him. Despite this duality, Christie was never happier than when he spent time with his father gardening, a hobby they both enjoyed, and even in later life Christie would seek solace in the small yard at the rear of 10 Rillington Place. Another aspect of John's youth that he claimed affected his view of life and death was the passing of his maternal grandfather, David Halliday, a man who in life had been a figure of fear, had died when his grandson was 12 years old, although Christie mistakenly claimed he was only 8. As was tradition at the time, the 75-year-old's body was laid out in the parlour of the home, and it was in this setting that Christie would encounter his first dead body. This would change his opinion on death. Viewing his stern and frightening grandfather now lying before him, lifeless, all fear left the youngster, who realised that death had stripped his grandfather of the power the old man had once had over him. Reflecting on his encounter, John stated, quote, "I was not in any way worried or perturbed." He would also go on to state, "All my life I had never experienced fear or horror at the sight of a corpse. On the contrary, I have seen many, and they hold an interest and fascination over me." There is a belief that this moment with his grandfather made Christie realise that death was an equaliser, which in later life he would find empowering as he took the lives of his victims. His early intrigue regarding death extended to him accompanying other children to the local cemetery, where they would peer through the gaps in the graves in the hopes of seeing the casket or the remains. Although Christie was not alone in these endeavours, it was noted by the children he was with that Christie had a, quote, peculiar fascination with the deceased. Upon leaving school at 14, Christie would go on to work as a projectionist at the local cinema, but at the outbreak of the First World War in 1914, he was eager to serve his country. He would, however, have to wait another 2 years to enlist, only to be placed on reserve. By 1917 he was mobilised, and having been sent to various camps around the country in order to complete training as a signalman, he would first see service on the front line when he was deployed to France and Flanders on the 2nd of April 1918, and a month later he was sent to serve with the Duke of Wellington Regiment. This move would be a critical one for him, as it was here that he would be the victim of a mustard gas attack, which Christie claimed rendered him blind, and he suffered muteness for 3.5 years. He would later use this experience to explain his quiet speech while testifying at Timothy Evans's trial. This garnered him sympathy and respect from those in the courtroom. Despite his claims, there are no medical records to prove that Christie was blinded during the attack, and although it is true he did become mute, with him being treated at numerous medical facilities, it would later be suggested that he was suffering from hysterical muteness rather than having a physical affliction. Christie had been a relatively healthy child, although he had suffered from rheumatic fever when he was 10, which meant he missed 5 months of schooling, and would be treated for pneumonia in 1915. He, however, did not seem to use these inflictions to his advantage. Yet after his experience during the war, he developed a tendency to exaggerate his illnesses for his own benefit, including him being able to claim a disability pension from 1919 to 1921. Christie's military service saw him awarded with the Victory and British medals. He had also been identified as a candidate for promotion, given his intellect and fastidious nature. Christie alleged that he declined the offers on 3 separate occasions as he did not wish to be parted from his fellow soldiers. His good conduct would change upon his return to England, when on the 31st of August 1919 he was written up for being absent from parade, and while being held under open arrest for this offence, he left the barracks and was declared absent without leave. When Christie returned 2 days later, he was charged with dereliction of duty and was denied 18 days' pay. Just over a month later, the now 20-year-old Christie was demobilised from the army. With his service record tainted, he would return to live with his parents in Halifax and went back to working as a cinema projectionist. It is around this time that he would become acquainted with Ethel Waddington Simpson, although even this aspect of Christie's life is clouded in uncertainty. Some reports state that they met due to living in close proximity with each other, and a chance encounter led to marriage. Others claim they met in 1914 while learning typing at an evening class, while some claim that the couple's courtship began when they both worked together at the same mill in 1920. Even Christie seems confused about how he met his wife, one time claiming he and Ethel only courted for a couple of months, while on another occasion he alleged they had known each other for several years. In 1920, the pair lived less than 10 minutes apart. The Christies, whose large brood had mostly flown the nest, had settled into a 3-bedroom terraced house, while Ethel lived in a modest 2-bedroom terraced house just a couple of blocks away. Ethel Simpson was born in the town the year prior to Christie, in 1898. She was the youngest of 3 children. Her father, William, worked at the nearby iron foundry, and they lived a more modest life in comparison to the Christies. The family's home life would become difficult upon the death of William, when Ethel was just 6 years old, which forced her mother Amy to raise her 3 children alone. Ethel's 13-year-old brother Henry took employment at the sanitary works, and when his sister Lily was old enough, she would begin work at a textile mill, where she would go on to become a textile designer. As soon as she finished her mandatory schooling at the age of 12, Ethel would follow her siblings into the workforce, becoming employed as a school milliner's errands girl. By the age of 22, Ethel had blossomed into an attractive young woman who had embraced the fashions of the time, with her hair styled in a soft finger wave, while her lips were painted with a dark rouge to accentuate the Cupid's bow. Ethel had secured employment as a clerk at the local mill. After taking evening classes, she acquired typing skills and obtained a diploma in shorthand. One story purports that it was during these classes that she met John, while others suggest she met him while they were employed in the same place. However they met, they would be married at the registry office on the 10th of May 1920, although the ceremony was alleged to have been witnessed by 2 strangers, with neither the bride or groom's family in attendance. The reason for their absence is lost to history, but it has been suggested that the couple were married soon after they met, suggesting that perhaps some impropriety had occurred prior to the marriage and they had to wed in order to maintain their respectability, but this cannot be confirmed. Following their wedding, the couple moved on to Brunswick Street, which was located close to the centre of the town, although the home has long since been demolished. From here, Ethel would head out to work at the mill, while John had taken employment as a postman, and it was in this role that he would commit his first criminal offence. He started the job on the 10th of January 1921, but the toil of walking for hours on end with a heavy bag led him to complain it was, quote, too much for me, as my left knee was not quite all right after the war injury, an injury that is not corroborated by any official records. Despite being in employment, Christie was called to meet with the medical board to assess his recovery after the gas attack. He told them he was doing well, and was only bothered by a husky voice when the weather was wet. The board, who concluded that his condition had improved, awarded Christie a pension to be paid over the preceding 70 days. He would serve as a postal worker for less than 3 months, but it was not his health that forced him to give up the role. It transpired that on the 20th of February 1921, 2 postal orders worth 4 shillings had gone missing, while another couple would go missing on the 26th of March, this time being valued at 8 shillings. An investigation focused on Christie, when it was identified that he had been responsible for delivering the postal orders. To confirm their suspicions, the employee was placed under surveillance, through which a letter which should have been delivered was found discarded in a public toilet. When a detective arrived at Christie's home, he calmly allowed the officer to conduct a search, during which the missing postal orders were discovered, along with numerous cheques valued at around £600. When he appeared in court to face the charges of theft, The judge took into account Christie's good character as a man who regularly attended church and had served and was wounded during the war. His character was also attested to by a journalist for the Halifax Courier who covered the trial, and wrote that Christie was, quote, the son of very respectable people. It was also noted that the defendant had not gained financially from the theft. The cheques had not been cashed and the postal orders had been undelivered, which the defence argued was down to Christie having issues with his memory due to his war injuries. The judge considered all these factors when sentencing Christie to what was considered a lenient sentence of 3 concurrent months to be served at Strangeways Prison in Manchester. Inexplicably, Christie moved back in with his parents upon his release from prison, although it is unclear whether Ethel joined him, and it is not known how long he stayed there, with his next known residence being listed as a guest house, which was run by Doris Moore. Having checked into Doris's establishment on the 7th of January 1923, he paid to rent a room for a week, yet on the 13th, after eating his breakfast, he told Mrs. Moore that he was unable to pay for the meal. By the 15th of January, Christie was back in court, charged with fraudulent behaviour, which he denied, stating that he had paid his room bill until the 15th, meaning that he had lost 2 nights due to him being arrested 2 days before he was due to check out. Christie also pointed out that the arrears he owed the landlady had been paid by his mother, and as such, he did not owe her any more money. The judge was once again lenient, placing Christie on probation for 12 months. He went on to tell the defendant to, quote, pull himself together and make a man of himself. It was around this time that Christie decided to leave Halifax, blaming his decision on the allegation that Ethel had been unfaithful while she had been working at the Garside Engineering Company in Bradford, with him claiming, quote, there was some trouble which I did not want to mention. My wife was having an affair with her employer, one Mr. Garside, and I left her. I know it was correct because I tackled the man and he admitted it. He would go on to blame Ethel's actions. The stress and upset caused by the affair resulted in him being mute for 6 months. Reflecting on her actions, Christie would later claim that the affair wasn't Ethel's fault, as she had been drinking heavily at the time. However, like many of Christie's claims, the only thing that can be verified is that Ethel did work at Garside's, although there is nothing to corroborate that she ever had an affair. Whether true or not, it may not have been the only reason why Christie left Halifax, with a newspaper article chronicling his next criminal act, which affected those closest to him. The column stated, quote, his parents are very respectable and had done all they could to put him straight. After all, his parents had done everything they could for him. He broke into their house and stole jewellery. Having cut ties with Ethel and damaged his relationship with his family, Christie would work as a painter in Manchester before he headed south to London, where he flitted from one bedsit to another. It was while he was living a nomadic and virtually penniless existence that he would be injured after being run over by a taxi, for which he had to have surgery on his left knee and right shoulder. However, these injuries did not prevent him from joining the Royal Air Force in December 1923. He enlisted as an aircraftman second class, and despite hoping that he would be stationed abroad, he was sent to work at the Electric and Wireless School in Uxbridge, 4 miles west of London. While being stationed at the RAF base, Christie also took up employment at the local cinema, although this would only last 4 months, and his military career wouldn't last long either, with his health causing him to be admitted to hospital on numerous occasions. He would be dismissed on medical grounds in August 1924. Just 9 days after being discharged, he would return to his criminal activities, this time targeting the cinema in Uxbridge where he had been employed briefly. Using the pretense of helping to repair some broken equipment, Christie was able to hide in the building until after the staff had closed for the night, at which point he helped himself to money, food, cigarettes and a glass cutter, an item he probably intended to use in future crimes. Cast out of the military and homeless, Christie was awakened by a police officer who found him sleeping on a park bench. However, it was not the fact that he was loitering that had caught the officer's attention. Instead, he had noted that the man on the bench matched the description of an individual who had been seen stealing a bike 4 days earlier. Initially, Christie provided a false name and denied being involved in the theft. He did, however, admit that a friend had asked him to sell a bike for them. This failed to alleviate the police officer's suspicions, who subsequently insisted on searching Christie, resulting in the discovery of the items that had been stolen from the cinema. Promptly arrested on suspicion of theft, Christie would once again stand in the dock as a defendant. During the trial, the testimony of Ernest Elliot would prove crucial. The witness would tell the court that Christie had brought the bike into his shop with a desire to sell it. The two men agreed that once the bike had been purchased, Christie would receive the proceeds. 24 hours later, Christie had returned to the shop to be advised that the bike had not sold, and upon learning this, the defendant claimed he required the money from the sale in order to pay for his tram journey to work. Deciding that he had the bike as collateral, Mr. Elliot agreed to give Christie some money, on the understanding that this would be reimbursed once the bike had sold. Yet the following day, Christie returned to the store again, and once again, after being told the bike was still unsold, he claimed he had been dismissed from his job after arriving late the previous day. Feeling sympathetic to the man's plight, Mr. Elliot once again loaned Christie some money. But his sympathy would turn to suspicion when the bike was sold on Saturday the 13th of September, and Christie returned to collect the proceeds. Although it is not clear what caused Mr. Elliot to question Christie's actions, he would go on to report his doubts to the police. His description of Christie matched that provided by the witness to the bike theft. With Christie being identified as the man who had stolen the bike and subsequently sold it through Mr. Elliot, the owner of the bike would confirm it was their property. Despite this, Christie took to the stand to defend himself, maintaining the claim that he had been given the bike by his friend Jack Smith, for whom Christie claimed, quote, "I have to stand here and bear the brunt of the charge." None of his claims could be corroborated, with Christie being unable to provide an address for the elusive Jack Smith, who could not be found despite a thorough search conducted by the police based on the defendant's descriptions. Unable to provide a sufficient defence, Christie was sentenced on 2 counts of theft, one for the bike and the other for the items from the cinema. He was given 2 consecutive sentences of 6 and 3 months, with him being incarcerated in Wandsworth Prison. Upon his release, 25-year-old Christie would spend the next few years maintaining a low profile. With no permanent home and failing to form any lasting relationships, he blended into the background of the crowded streets of London. In the summer of 1928, Christie had met Mrs. Maud Cole, and in what seemed a mutually beneficial arrangement, he moved into the flat she shared with her young son in Battersea, which provided Christie with somewhere to live, and Mrs. Cole, who was separated from her husband, would receive financial assistance with regards to the household expenses. The arrangement seemed to be satisfactory, with Christie and Mrs. Cole developing a fondness for each other, but tensions would arise in April of 1929. Despite hoping for assistance with the finances, Christie had not been paying his way, which initially had not been an issue as he tended to spend more time away from the home than he did in it. But after almost a year, and with him now unemployed, Mrs. Cole could no longer accept the situation and gave Christie an ultimatum. Either he got a job or he moved out. With Christie refusing to seek employment, it was agreed that he should vacate the flat, and on the 1st of May 1929, Christie and Mrs. Cole sat down for what would likely be one of their last meals together before he moved out. While Maud sat at the table, Christie excused himself, and shortly afterwards she felt something strike at the back of her head, which she went on to describe, quote, "It half stunned me. It was all the world like an explosion. Everything seemed to go black for a second." She then recalled trying to stand and feeling Christie's fingers in her mouth. She managed to pull them away and cried out, and she made for the door of the flat. Alerted to the noise, the tenant from the flat above came running to witness Mrs. Cole being pushed out of her front door, with her head bleeding profusely. Escorted to her neighbour's flat, the police were called, and arrived to find the door to Mrs. Cole's unit was locked, and upon forcing it open, the room was found to be empty, with evidence that someone had exited via the window. Mrs. Cole was admitted to hospital, where her wound was tended to. Yet it was while there that she would receive an unwelcome visitor, in the form of John Christie, who apologised and alleged that it had been a terrible accident, and he'd hit her on the head with a cricket bat when he was playing with it. His grovelling did not sway her opinion, and he left. At trial, Christie stood accused of grievous bodily harm, which he would dispute, claiming that the incident was an accident. He explained that he had been testing how the bat handled, and did not realise he had struck Mrs. Cole until she was on the floor. He continued by stating that when he saw she had been injured, that he panicked, pushed her out of the room, and fled through the window. During his sentencing, the judge stated that Christie was a man of cowardly temperament, and described his assault on Mrs. Cole as a murderous attack, for which Christie would be sentenced to 6 months of hard labour at Wandsworth Prison. He would return to the same prison 4 years later, having been sentenced to 3 months for the theft of a motor vehicle. This incident occurred on Sunday the 23rd of October 1933, when he was found to be in possession of a Morris Oxford motor car. He told the arresting officer he did not have a licence or insurance for the vehicle, going on to claim that, quote, "I was picked up by another man who has gone to look for lodgings, and he left me here to drive the car into the yard." At trial, he was charged with the theft of a motor vehicle and driving without a licence or insurance. He did not contest the charges and was sentenced to 3 months of hard labour with regards to the theft, and he was offered 2 options regarding the other charges, either pay a fine or serve an additional 7 days in prison. He opted for the latter, as well as being disqualified from driving for a year. Whilst serving his sentence, he would receive a visit from Ethel, who had learned of her estranged husband's whereabouts and came to the prison to discuss the future of their relationship. During their 10 years apart, Ethel had been living in Bradford, close to her sister Lily and her nephew Edwin, yet redundancy in 1928 would force her to move to Sheffield, where she would reside with her brother Henry, with Lily and her family relocating to the same street shortly after. It was while residing in Sheffield that Ethel would develop a relationship with Vaughan Brindley, who would later describe her as a refined, well-bred and educated young woman. She was extremely attractive. She was also respectable, did not frequent pubs and did not smoke. Ethel had made Vaughan aware that she had been married previously, but had told him that her husband had died after being wounded during the war. As the pair began to discuss marriage and children, it caused friction, with Johnathan Oates, the author of John Christie of Rillington Place, Biography of a Serial Killer, suggesting that Ethel was unable to have children, possibly due to an earlier miscarriage. Unable to reconcile their differences, the relationship ended and Ethel made the journey to visit her estranged husband, intent on defining their future. According to Christie, they discussed whether to reconcile or file for divorce, with him alleging that when asked what she wanted to do, Ethel chose reconciliation. On the 17th of January 1934, Christie was released from prison, allowing for him to reunite with Ethel. The couple decided to remain in London, and by the end of 1934, they were residing at number 23 Oxford Gardens in Notting Hill, which stood just a short walk from Rillington Place. Christie would later reflect on his rekindled relationship with Ethel, making an effort to portray himself as a thoughtful and attentive husband, emphasising that when Ethel came home from work on a night, she would be tired and her feet would hurt. He alleged he always made sure she had a meal waiting for her and would run his wife a bath to help her unwind. However, despite this attentiveness, he was still using the services of sex workers to indulge his desire for control. In 1937, the couple took residence in the home that would become known as a House of Horrors, 10 Rillington Place. The property was the last house on the left, at the end of the cul-de-sac, which came to an abrupt end at a brick wall, beyond which rose the towering chimneys of an ironworks. Due to being a dead-end street, it proved to be a haven for children to play, while their mothers kept a watchful eye from the doorways. Despite the cheerful sounds of children echoing along the street, its appearance reflected the true nature of the area. Many of the homes were dilapidated, their crumbling facades hinting at their former grandeur. This area of Notting Hill was considered to be one of the most deprived in London, with low employment rates and high mortality rates. Number 10, like many of the homes in the street, had once been intended for a single family to occupy. But as the area declined, the home was divided, and so the house now had 3 flats, each one occupying its own floor. When the Christies first took up residence in the home, they initially lived on the top floor, which would be occupied by the Evans family almost a decade later. Below them resided Mr. Charles Kitchener, who had been living in the property for over 15 years, while on the ground floor was home to Edward and Winifred Smith, and when the Smiths vacated, the Christies would move into the empty flat. The home was described by Jessie F. Tennyson as, quote, "The staircase is narrow and it is impossible for anyone to do much about the house without the other inhabitants hearing. On the ground floor there is an ugly Victorian bay window to the front room of the house, surrounded by crumbling sandstone. This was the room the Christies used as their sitting room. Their bedroom was behind it, with a window looking out onto the backyard and the garden, and a tiny kitchen, a mere box of a room, was beyond it, on the other side of the narrow passageway which led out to the garden and the communal water closet." Over the next couple of years, Christie was able to hold down a steady job at the Commodore Cinema in Hammersmith. He and Edith would acquire an Irish Terrier and a cat, and it seemed that Christie had finally settled down, living an honest, respectable life with his wife. They became another unremarkable couple living mundane lives. But this would be shattered in 1939 with the outbreak of the Second World War. It was during the conflict that John Christie took up the role of a wartime reserve constable for the police, a position that under normal circumstances he would have been prevented from undertaking due to his criminal record. But with the demand for officers and limited resources, proper checks could not be carried out, allowing John Christie to don the uniform of a police officer. He relished this position of authority, and took care to ensure he mentioned to people he met that he was on the force, which garnered him a great deal of respect. With Tom Jarrett, who worked alongside Christie, recalling, quote, "It gave him a certain status and a sense of power over ordinary people. He liked to flash his warrant card and boast about the number of people he had knocked off." Christie would send a picture of himself in the uniform to his mother, despite having been estranged from her since he stole from his family's home. Perhaps he hoped that seeing him in the uniform, his parents would see that he had turned his life around, and maybe he would earn his father's approval. John Christie was considered a good officer. He was presentable in appearance and mild-mannered in nature, with improving himself to not only be a stickler for the rules, but to be efficient in how he operated. This led to him receiving a couple of commendations, one for the arrest of a man making false air raid warnings, and the other was for his diligent work investigating the theft of a bike. Being in the force meant he was often placed in danger, as he helped ensure the safety of civilians. Christie would later claim, quote, "I was shaken on 2 occasions by bombs dropping while on duty. On the second occasion, I was nearly overcome by gas from a fractured main in the street while getting people to a rest centre. On the first time, I was in Kilburn Lane when a bomb exploded in Harrow Road, approximately 100 yards away. I was knocked down but carried on helping in rescue work." Not only did the position make him appear to be a brave and respectable man, he also acquired experience testifying in court, where a judge commended his manner in delivering his statement. Both his court experience and an air of respectability would help make him appear a reliable witness when testifying against Timothy Evans. But his role also revealed another side to Christie. Now holding a position of authority, he would bring his fastidious nature to bear on Rillington Place. He would complain about cars being parked on the street, and his behaviour was remembered by Mrs. McFadden, who lived on the street. She stated that Christie would, quote, "often try to use his police authority to tell us to do what he wanted. He threatened to report practically everybody on the street for some lighting or other supposed irregularity. Yet he still presented the guise of a dutiful husband, accompanying Ethel on trips to visit her family in Sheffield. It is believed that she was unaware that he was still frequenting sex workers, with a fellow police officer claiming that Christie would regularly pick up sex workers on numerous occasions. His infidelity would deepen when he began an affair with a co-worker, Gladys Jones, whose husband was serving in the Royal Air Force. The couple initially met sometime between 1942 and 1943, and they would conduct their relationship during the day when Christie would visit Gladys's home in Ladbroke Grove. Gladys would later express, quote, "I do not wish to go into any details respecting my acquaintance with Christie, but he was cited as correspondent in the divorce action. The relationship is believed to have continued until after the war had ended, when Gladys's husband returned home from service to find the pair in a compromising position, after which a physical altercation occurred between the two men. It would, however, be his encounter with another woman that would lead him down the path to murder. Join me next time to learn more about the life and death of Christie's first victim. So in the meantime, keep an eye on those shadows.